Power rarely sees itself as cruel. History makes this painfully clear when we look closely at the rise of empires, the harshest decisions, and the most devastating campaigns. One pattern quietly repeats itself. Those who held power almost always believed they were right. The most dangerous feature of power is not simply its ability to command or to punish. It is its growing certainty in its own correctness. When humans acquire power, their capabilities do not change alone. Their perception of reality begins to shift. Doubt slowly becomes less comfortable. Criticism begins to sound less like guidance and more like obstruction. And at a certain point, power no longer merely makes decisions. It begins to justify itself. Across history, pharaohs believed they ruled by divine design. Emperors convinced themselves that destiny had chosen them. Revolutionary leaders labeled brutality as a necessary phase. Modern authority rarely announces, "I want control." Instead, it speaks in calmer language, "I am protecting you." This is where the pattern becomes most unsettling, because once power frames itself as protection, resistance begins to look like disorder. Questioning begins to look like disloyalty, and the line between necessity and excess becomes increasingly difficult to see. Beneath the surface of history, a quiet mechanism repeats itself. As power expands, certainty grows. As certainty grows, doubt begins to fade. As doubt fades, the ability to recognize error weakens. And again, some of the most consequential decisions in history were made at the exact moment when those in control felt most certain of their righteousness. This raises a deeply uncomfortable question. If power almost always believes it is justified, who and at what moment is left to recognize the mistake? Because history suggests something both simple and disturbing. The greatest danger has rarely been power alone. It has been power that stopped questioning itself. This is not only a story about the past, it is a pattern that echoes forward, quietly, persistently, into every system that begins to trust its own certainty too much. The psychological mechanism of power does not begin with cruelty. It begins with perception. When an individual or institution accumulates authority, something subtle but profound starts to shift inside the human mind. Power does not simply expand what a person can do. It quietly reshapes how reality itself is interpreted. This transformation is rarely sudden. It unfolds gradually, often invisibly, and frequently without conscious awareness. The person in power usually does not feel morally corrupted. In fact, the opposite often occurs. They begin to feel more responsible, more justified, and more certain that their decisions are necessary. One of the core drivers of this shift is cognitive dissonance reduction. Humans have a deep psychological need to see themselves as rational and morally consistent. When someone with power makes a harsh or controversial decision, the mind experiences tension between the action taken and the self-image of being reasonable or just. To resolve this discomfort, the brain often adjusts the interpretation of the action rather than the self-image. The decision becomes reframed as necessary. The consequences become minimized. The opposition becomes easier to dismiss. Over time, this process builds a powerful internal narrative. If I chose it, there must have been a good reason. Closely connected to this is what psychologists sometimes call moral licensing. The more responsibility and status individuals believe they carry, the more likely they are to feel that difficult decisions fall uniquely within their legitimate authority. Power creates a psychological environment in which exceptional actions begin to feel proportionate to exceptional responsibility. What might once have felt extreme begins to feel situational. What once required hesitation begins to feel procedural. This is not always driven by malice. It often emerges from the human tendency to align behavior with perceived role expectations. Authority bias further amplifies the effect. Not only does power reshape the mind of the person who holds it, but it also alters how others respond to that person. When authority is recognized, surrounding individuals become more likely to defer, to agree, or to remain silent in the face of questionable decisions. This social reinforcement loop is critical because power rarely operates in isolation. It is stabilized by the reactions of those nearby. When dissent weakens and agreement becomes the dominant feedback signal, the internal confidence of the decision-maker strengthens even further. Over time, a feedback chamber can form. Successful decisions from the past create reputational momentum. Future doubts are filtered through prior victories. Institutional systems begin to protect established authority rather than continuously challenge it. What begins as functional leadership can gradually harden into something more rigid, a structure that becomes increasingly resistant to self-correction. The danger here is not immediate tyranny. The danger is progressive insulation. Historical patterns suggest that the most consequential errors often do not occur when leaders feel uncertain. They occur when leaders feel unusually certain, when the internal checks of doubt have been softened by repeated reinforcement, when the external checks of criticism have weakened due to hierarchy or fear, when both internal and external friction decline at the same time. The psychological environment becomes uniquely vulnerable to overreach. This is why the psychology of power is so persistent across different eras, cultures, and political systems. The surface language changes, the symbols of authority change, the institutions change, but the underlying cognitive pressures remain remarkably consistent. Power increases perceived responsibility. Responsibility encourages justification. Justification reduces doubt. Reduced doubt weakens self-correction. And in that narrowing space, some of history's most consequential misjudgments have quietly taken shape. Understanding this mechanism does not require assuming that every powerful figure intended harm. More often, the pattern emerges from ordinary human cognitive architecture, operating under extraordinary levels of influence. The mind adapts to authority, the environment reinforces confidence, and slowly, often imperceptibly, the distance between certainty and error begins to shrink. This is the quiet psychological gravity that has followed power throughout human history, not as an exception, but as a recurring structural tendency built into the way human cognition responds to control, responsibility, and reinforced belief. In many ancient empires, power did not present itself as mere political control. It presented itself as cosmic necessity. The concept often described today as divine right was not simply propaganda in the modern sense. It was a deeply embedded worldview that fused political authority with the structure of the universe itself. In societies where uncertainty about nature, survival, and fate was constant, legitimacy drawn from the heavens carried enormous stabilizing force. When rulers claimed divine sanction, they were not only asserting dominance, they were redefining opposition as disorder against the natural order. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a king. He was understood as a living bridge between the human world and the divine realm. The stability of the Nile, the fertility of the land, and the balance of cosmic order, known as Ma'at, were symbolically tied to the pharaoh's authority. To question the ruler was not framed as political disagreement. It risked appearing as a threat to universal balance itself. This fusion of governance and cosmology created one of the most resilient legitimacy systems in early state formation. Power was not defended only by force. It was protected by meaning. A similar but structurally distinct pattern appeared in imperial China through the doctrine often called the mandate of heaven. Unlike the Egyptian model, this framework allowed for the theoretical withdrawal of divine approval if a ruler failed catastrophically. Natural disasters, famine, or widespread unrest could be interpreted as signals that heaven had revoked its mandate. Yet in practice, this system still reinforced authority during periods of stability, because as long as order appeared intact, the ruling dynasty could frame its position as cosmically endorsed. This created a powerful feedback loop between visible stability and perceived legitimacy. In the Roman imperial tradition, divine association evolved in a more politically flexible form. Early emperors did not always claim to be gods in life, but the imperial cult gradually blurred the boundary between reverence and governance. Emperors were deified after death, temples were erected in their honor, and loyalty to the imperial figure became intertwined with civic identity. This process did not require universal literal belief. It required sufficient symbolic acceptance to reinforce hierarchy. The genius of the Roman approach was its adaptability. Divine framing could be intensified or softened depending on political need, while still preserving the psychological distance between ruler and subject. Across these different civilizations, the underlying psychological function remained strikingly consistent. Divine right reduced the cognitive space for opposition. If authority comes from the heavens, resistance begins to resemble rebellion against the structure of reality itself. This does not mean ancient populations were naive or incapable of skepticism. Historical records show periodic revolts, succession crises, and legitimacy disputes, but the divine framework raised the psychological cost of dissent. It shifted the burden of proof onto the challenger. From a philosophical perspective, the power of divine legitimacy lies in how it transforms political hierarchy into moral inevitability. Once authority is embedded within cosmic narrative, obedience begins to feel less like submission and more like alignment with order. This is one of the most effective stabilizing strategies in pre-modern governance systems. It does not eliminate conflict entirely, but it raises the threshold at which large-scale resistance becomes thinkable. What makes this pattern especially important is its persistence. The explicit language of divine right may have weakened in many modern political systems, yet the underlying mechanism has not fully disappeared. Power still often seeks moral framing beyond mere force. It still benefits from narratives that portray authority as necessary, protective, or historically inevitable. The symbols have changed. The theological vocabulary has softened. But the psychological architecture that once supported divine kingship continues to echo in quieter forms across many structures of modern authority. This is why the study of divine right in ancient empires is not simply about distant history. It reveals a recurring human tendency. Power becomes most stable when it successfully presents itself not as a choice made by humans, but as an order written into the structure of the world itself. The relationship between religion and political legitimacy has been one of the most enduring and powerful alliances in human history, not because rulers always controlled belief directly, but because belief systems provided something that raw force alone could never fully achieve: internalized obedience. When authority is supported only by visible power, compliance often depends on fear. When authority is reinforced by sacred meaning, compliance begins to feel morally appropriate. This distinction has shaped the stability of states for thousands of years. In many pre-modern societies, political leaders quickly recognized that governing through coercion alone was inefficient and unstable. Force can compel behavior in the short term, but it requires constant reinforcement and produces long-term resistance. Religion, by contrast, offered a way to align political hierarchy with cosmic purpose. When religious institutions and ruling structures became intertwined, obedience could be framed not merely as survival strategy, but as ethical duty. This dramatically lowered the cost of maintaining large, complex societies. During the medieval period in Europe, the alliance between throne and altar became particularly explicit. Monarchs derived legitimacy through coronation rituals performed by religious authorities, while religious institutions benefited from state protection and material support. This mutual reinforcement created a powerful feedback system. The king ruled by divine sanction. The church validated that sanction, and the population encountered a unified narrative in which political order and spiritual order appeared inseparable. To resist the ruler could be interpreted not only as treason, but as spiritual error. A similar structural pattern appeared in various forms across the Islamic caliphates, Byzantine governance, and numerous other historical states. The specific theological frameworks differed, but the functional logic remained consistent. Political authority gained durability when it was embedded within a larger sacred story. This did not eliminate dissent or rebellion entirely. History is filled with revolts, schisms, and legitimacy crises, but the religious dimension raised the psychological and social cost of opposition. It made resistance more cognitively complex for the average subject. One of the most important psychological effects of this fusion was moral reframing. When policies, taxes, wars, or legal structures were presented within a sacred narrative, they became more difficult to evaluate purely on material grounds. People were not only responding to political authority, they were responding to perceived alignment with divine order. This layered legitimacy often allowed states to maintain stability even during periods of significant hardship because the system was buffered by meaning, not just enforcement. However, this alliance also introduced long-term tensions. When political authority relies heavily on sacred validation, legitimacy becomes vulnerable to theological dispute. If competing religious interpretations emerge, the political structure can become exposed to fragmentation. This dynamic can be seen in periods such as the Protestant Reformation, where religious fragmentation rapidly translated into political instability. The same mechanism that once strengthened authority could, under different conditions, accelerate its weakening. In the modern era, explicit fusion between religion and state authority has declined in many parts of the world, particularly in formally secular systems. Yet the deeper psychological pattern has not disappeared. Power still seeks moral narratives that elevate obedience beyond simple compliance. Modern states may speak less frequently in overtly sacred language, but they often frame authority in terms of protection, security, historical necessity, or collective survival. These narratives perform a function structurally similar to earlier religious legitimization. They transform political hierarchy into something that feels justified at a deeper level. From a philosophical perspective, the alliance between religion and political legitimacy reveals a recurring truth about human governance systems. Power becomes most stable when it is not experienced merely as external pressure, but as internally accepted order. When obedience feels meaningful rather than forced, systems require less visible coercion to maintain control. This does not mean religion always serves power, nor that belief systems are inherently political tools. The historical reality is more complex and varies across time and culture. But again and again, across civilizations, the convergence of sacred meaning and political authority has proven to be one of the most effective and most enduring, stabilizing mechanisms in human history. In the modern era, the self-justification of power has not disappeared. It has evolved. The language is softer. The symbols are less overtly sacred. The mechanisms are more psychologically sophisticated, but the underlying pattern remains strikingly familiar. Modern authority rarely presents itself as domination. Instead, it frames its actions through necessity, protection, efficiency, or collective good. This shift is not accidental. It reflects a deeper understanding, conscious or not, of how human minds respond to legitimacy. Unlike many ancient systems that relied heavily on explicit divine sanction, modern power structures often operate through what might be called rationalized justification. Decisions are explained through data, security concerns, economic stability, public safety, or long-term planning. These frameworks create a powerful perception of procedural legitimacy. Actions that might otherwise provoke resistance become embedded within narratives of responsibility and risk management. The result is not the disappearance of coercive capacity, but its psychological reframing. One of the central cognitive forces at work here is institutional moral buffering. When decisions are distributed across committees, agencies, and layered bureaucracies, individual responsibility becomes diffused. No single actor experiences the full moral weight of the outcome. This fragmentation makes self-justification easier at every level. Each participant sees their role as partial, procedural, or necessary within a larger system. The system, in turn, presents itself as operating according to rational necessity rather than personal will. Modern propaganda, in its most effective form, rarely relies on overt falsehood alone. It often works by selective framing, emphasis, and narrative shaping. Information environments are structured so that certain interpretations feel more immediately reasonable than others. When populations are repeatedly exposed to consistent framing, the boundaries of what feels legitimate gradually shift. This does not require total information control. It requires enough narrative stability to anchor public perception. Another important factor is the psychology of risk management. Modern societies are highly sensitive to uncertainty and threat. Authority structures that successfully present themselves as risk reducers gain powerful legitimacy advantages. When policies are framed as preventing future harm, opposing them can psychologically resemble accepting danger. This dynamic creates a subtle but effective pressure toward compliance. The language of protection becomes one of the most durable tools of modern self-justification. There is also the influence of technocratic complexity. As governance systems become more specialized and data-driven, the distance between decision makers and the general population increases. Complexity itself can function as a stabilizing barrier. When policies are difficult to evaluate without expert knowledge, public challenge becomes less frequent and more fragmented. This does not imply deliberate concealment in every case, but structurally, it reduces friction against institutional confidence. From a historical perspective, what is most striking is not that modern power justifies itself. That has always occurred. What is notable is how much more seamlessly the process can now operate. The language of necessity replaces the language of destiny. The language of protection replaces the language of divine command. The language of systems replaces the language of individual will. Yet beneath these shifts, the psychological architecture shows remarkable continuity. Power still tends to interpret its own actions through a lens of responsibility rather than excess. It still benefits from reduced dissent in environments where uncertainty is high. It still grows more confident when feedback loops become insulated. And as in earlier eras, the greatest risk does not usually emerge when authority feels uncertain. It emerges when the system becomes deeply convinced that its actions are not only effective, but unquestionably justified. This is why the modern phase of self-justifying power is so complex to analyze. It rarely appears in openly authoritarian language. It often speaks in calm, procedural, data-supported tones. It emphasizes stability, prevention, and long-term safety. But history suggests a consistent caution. When any system, ancient or modern, becomes too certain of its own necessity, the space for self-correction can begin to narrow. And it is within that narrowing space that some of the most consequential miscalculations in history have quietly taken shape. Historical case studies reveal that the self-justification of power is not an abstract theory. It is a recurring pattern that appears across very different civilizations, ideologies, and time periods. When examined closely, some of history's most consequential decisions were made not by leaders who openly embraced cruelty, but by leaders who were deeply convinced of the necessity of their actions. The language changes, the symbols change, the context changes, but the psychological structure remains strikingly consistent. In the late Roman Republic and early Empire, expansion was rarely framed internally as simple conquest. It was frequently presented as preemptive security or civilizational duty. Roman political culture developed a powerful narrative in which military campaigns were justified as stabilizing measures against external threats, or as the extension of order into chaotic regions. This framing allowed expansion to feel defensive, even when it was aggressively proactive. The Roman system did not require every citizen to believe the narrative completely. It only required enough alignment that resistance to expansion felt less urgent than participation in it. During the Reign of Terror in revolutionary France, the language of necessity became even more explicit. Leading figures such as Robespierre did not typically present their policies as expressions of cruelty. They framed them as morally required steps to protect the revolution from internal collapse and external enemies. The guillotine was described not as excess, but as a tool of purification. The logic was internally coherent. If the revolution represented virtue, then threats to it could be interpreted as existential dangers. This is one of the clearest historical examples of moral certainty amplifying coercive policy. What made the period so volatile was not only the use of force, but the conviction that force was ethically unavoidable. A different but structurally related pattern appeared in various 20th century totalitarian systems. These regimes often operated through highly developed ideological frameworks that transformed political goals into historical necessity. Actions were rarely presented to internal audiences as arbitrary domination. They were framed as required steps toward stability, unity, or long-term survival. The more comprehensive the ideological narrative became, the more difficult it was for internal actors to perceive policy escalation as deviation. Instead, escalation often appeared as logical continuation. Even in non-totalitarian contexts, similar mechanisms have appeared at smaller scale. Military interventions across different eras have frequently been framed by decision-makers as preventive or stabilizing rather than expansionary. Economic policies that produced severe short-term hardship have often been justified internally as unavoidable corrections necessary for long-term recovery. Institutional actors typically do not experience themselves as operating outside moral boundaries. They experience themselves as managing complex risk environments under constrained conditions. What these case studies demonstrate is not that all powerful actors are consciously deceptive. History shows a more complicated and more psychologically uncomfortable pattern. In many cases, decision-makers appear to have genuinely believed in the necessity of their actions. This is precisely what makes the mechanism so persistent. Self-justification does not always require bad faith. It often emerges from ordinary cognitive pressures operating within high-stakes environments. Across these different historical moments, a common sequence can be observed. Authority accumulates. Responsibility narratives expand. External threats, real or perceived, intensify. Internal dissent becomes easier to reinterpret as destabilizing noise rather than corrective feedback. With each step, the margin for self-doubt narrows, And once that margin becomes sufficiently thin, escalation can occur with surprisingly little internal resistance. The lesson of these case studies is not that power inevitably corrupts in a simple or uniform way. It is that power consistently reshapes the interpretive environment in which decisions are made. When systems become highly confident in the necessity of their own actions, the internal friction that normally moderates risk begins to weaken. History does not repeat this pattern because the actors are identical. It repeats because the psychological architecture surrounding authority has remained remarkably stable across centuries. Understanding this pattern is critical not for assigning retrospective blame alone, but for recognizing how easily the same dynamics can emerge under new institutional forms. The surface language of power evolves. The emotional tone becomes more procedural. The justifications become more data-driven, but the underlying human tendency toward self-reinforcing certainty under conditions of authority continues to appear with striking regularity. Group psychology is where the dynamics of power become significantly more complex because authority rarely operates in isolation. Even the most dominant leaders function within networks of advisors, supporters, institutions, and silent observers. The behavior of the group surrounding power often determines whether questionable decisions are challenged early or allowed to accelerate unchecked. What makes this especially important is that group dynamics do not require explicit agreement to reinforce authority. Silence, hesitation, and passive compliance can be just as stabilizing as active support. One of the most studied mechanisms in this domain is groupthink. When cohesive groups operate under pressure for consensus, dissent gradually becomes psychologically uncomfortable. Members begin to self-censor not necessarily because they fully agree, but because social friction carries a cost. Over time, the range of acceptable opinions narrows. With fewer visible objections, the dominant position appears increasingly validated. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. The absence of dissent is interpreted as confirmation of correctness, even when private doubts remain widespread beneath the surface. Closely related to this is the phenomenon of pluralistic ignorance. In many historical situations, individuals privately questioned decisions, but assumed they were alone in their doubts. Because each person observed public conformity from others, they concluded that the majority must genuinely support the direction being taken. As a result, collective silence emerged even in environments where private concern was significant. This psychological mirage has appeared repeatedly in political, military, and institutional settings across history. Obedience to authority further amplifies the effect when hierarchical structures are clear and legitimacy is strongly signaled. Individuals often shift from personal moral evaluation toward role-based compliance. The question subtly changes from, "Is this right?" to, "Is this my place to question it?" This cognitive shift dramatically lowers the probability of early resistance. It does not require individuals to abandon their moral framework entirely. It simply reframes responsibility boundaries in a way that favors procedural continuation over disruptive challenge. Social proof also plays a powerful stabilizing role in group environments. Humans are highly sensitive to the behavior of those around them, especially under conditions of uncertainty. When individuals observe apparent consensus, even if that consensus is partially artificial, they become more likely to align outwardly with the group position. This effect becomes especially strong in high-stakes institutional environments where deviation carries reputational or professional risk. The result is often a gradual smoothing of visible disagreement, even when underlying uncertainty remains. Fear of isolation adds another psychological layer. Humans are deeply social organisms. and exclusion historically carried significant survival costs. In modern institutional contexts, the threat is usually reputational rather than physical, but the underlying emotional circuitry remains powerful. When individuals sense that dissent may lead to marginalization, career damage, or loss of status, many choose cautious silence. This does not require explicit coercion. The anticipation of social cost is often sufficient. What makes group psychology particularly consequential in the history of power is that it creates momentum. Once a dominant narrative becomes established within a decision-making circle, reversing direction becomes progressively harder. Each additional participant who publicly aligns with the position increases the perceived legitimacy of the course already set. This is why some of history's most consequential miscalculations were not the result of a single unchecked leader. They emerged from environments where many intelligent individuals gradually synchronized around a narrowing range of acceptable doubt. Importantly, group reinforcement does not always arise from manipulation or bad faith. Often it emerges from ordinary human tendencies toward cohesion, efficiency, and role clarity. In complex systems, constant open conflict is costly. Groups naturally evolve toward smoother coordination. But under conditions of high authority concentration and high perceived threat, this adaptive tendency can unintentionally suppress critical friction at precisely the moments when it is most needed. This is why the psychology of power cannot be fully understood at the level of the individual alone. The surrounding human network matters profoundly. Power becomes most insulated not when one person stops questioning, but when many people simultaneously become less willing to introduce friction. And history shows that when both internal certainty and external conformity rise together, the system enters one of its most fragile states. Not because it appears unstable. Power that believes it is right is rarely the loudest force in history. It does not always appear openly tyrannical. It does not always recognize itself as dangerous. In many cases, it moves forward with calm certainty, supported by logic, reinforced by responsibility, and protected by the quiet agreement of those around it. This is what makes it so historically persistent. The most consequential decisions are often made not in moments of obvious cruelty, but in moments of deep conviction. Across centuries, rulers, councils, and entire systems have acted under the same internal assurance, the belief that the risks were necessary, that the actions were justified, that the alternatives were more dangerous. History rarely records these moments as expressions of doubt. More often, they are framed as moments of clarity. That is precisely where the pattern becomes most unsettling, because when power becomes fully convinced of its own necessity, the internal friction that normally moderates risk begins to fade. This does not mean that every powerful system inevitably collapses, nor that authority itself is inherently unstable. The deeper lesson is more structural. Power operates within human psychology, and human psychology is highly sensitive to reinforcement, responsibility, and perceived threat. When authority accumulates without equally strong mechanisms for self-questioning, confidence can gradually outpace correction. The system begins to move smoothly, efficiently, and with increasing certainty, right up to the point where adaptation becomes difficult. Time and again, history shows the same quiet sequence. As responsibility increases, justification expands. As justification expands, doubt becomes less comfortable. As doubt fades, the space for early correction narrows. And when the margin for correction becomes too thin, even intelligent and well-intentioned systems can move into decisions that later appear dangerously miscalculated in hindsight. What makes this pattern enduring is that it rarely feels like overreach from the inside. It feels like management. It feels like protection. It feels like necessary action taken under pressure. This is why the most important safeguard in any powerful system has never been confidence alone. It has been the preserved ability to question that confidence, because the greatest danger in history has rarely been power by itself. It has been power that gradually stopped examining its own certainty, power that no longer encountered meaningful friction, power that became surrounded not by opposition but by reinforcing agreement. And perhaps the most uncomfortable implication is this: the mechanisms described in the past did not disappear. They evolved. They adapted. They continue to operate quietly and persistently wherever authority, responsibility, and human cognition intersect. History does not repeat itself in events. It repeats itself in patterns. The dates change. The names change. The borders shift. But the human mind beneath them remains strikingly familiar. Every empire believes it is unique. Every civilization believes it has learned from the past. And yet when power rises, it rises in the same way, driven by the same fears, sustained by the same promises, and protected by the same justifications. This is not because leaders study old empires. It is because they govern the same psychology. Humans have always struggled with uncertainty. Chaos terrifies the mind more deeply than injustice does. Disorder feels like threat. Even when order is cruel, it feels safer than the unknown. And whenever societies grow large enough that individuals can no longer know one another, personally, systems emerge to replace trust. These systems are built not on truth, but on predictability. Empires begin as solutions to fear. They promise stability, they promise safety, they promise continuity. In exchange, they ask for obedience. At first, this exchange feels reasonable, even necessary. People do not experience it as oppression. They experience it as relief, because something frightening has been named, controlled and organized. History shows that empires are rarely born from ambition alone. They are born from anxiety, the anxiety that without authority, society will collapse. The anxiety that without hierarchy, nothing will hold. The anxiety that without force, order will dissolve. This fear is not irrational. It is human, but it becomes dangerous when it hardens into belief. When belief turns into structure, and structure turns into identity. Once identity is formed, the empire no longer needs constant violence. People begin to defend the system because it explains who they are. Citizen, subject, chosen, civilized, loyal. These labels carry comfort. They answer the question of belonging, and belonging is one of the deepest human needs. This is why people often protect empires even when they suffer under them. The empire gives them a place in the world. Without it, they would face uncertainty again. History repeats because this exchange is seductive. It offers meaning in a world that feels unstable. It offers direction in a world that feels overwhelming, and it offers belonging in a world where isolation feels like death. Empires understand this intuitively. They do not need everyone to believe, only enough people to comply. And compliance is easier when obedience feels moral, when loyalty feels virtuous, when questioning feels dangerous. This is why the tools of empire evolve, while the psychology remains constant. Ancient empires used gods and myths. Medieval empires used faith and divine order. Modern empires use progress, security, and choice. The language changes, the symbols change, but the psychological contract remains the same. Give up some freedom, receive order. Give up uncertainty, receive identity. Give up questioning, receive belonging. History does not repeat because people forget. It repeats because the same human needs are activated again and again: fear of chaos, desire for meaning, need for acceptance. These forces shape empires more reliably than weapons ever could. And as long as these needs remain unexamined, power will continue to build itself around them. This is why looking at history as a series of events misses the deeper truth. What endures is not empire, but the psychological conditions that allow empire to exist. Until those conditions are understood, the future will continue to resemble the past. Not because humans are doomed, but because psychology unexamined becomes destiny. Every empire begins with fear, not confidence. Before conquest, before ideology, before expansion, there is a perception of threat. The threat may be real or imagined, external or internal, but it must exist because fear is the most reliable trigger for collective obedience. When humans feel threatened, they seek protection. When protection is offered, they accept authority. The first imperial reflex is not domination, it is defense, or at least the story of defense. Early empires did not announce themselves as empires. They presented themselves as responses to danger, invading tribes, hostile neighbors, internal disorder, moral decay, chaos at the borders. Fear creates urgency, and urgency suspends questioning. People do not ask whether power is justified when they believe survival is at stake. They ask only whether it is strong enough. This is how authority is born without resistance. Once fear enters the collective mind, compromise feels irresponsible. Doubt feels disloyal. Hesitation feels dangerous. The empire frames itself as the barrier between order and collapse. And this framing is powerful because it aligns authority with safety. To oppose power then feels like exposing the group to danger. Even when the threat fades, the structure remains. Fear leaves a residue. It reshapes perception. It teaches people to see uncertainty as risk and risk as something to be eliminated. This is why empires often exaggerate threats. They must keep fear alive to justify their existence. An empire without danger begins to look unnecessary. So danger is maintained through language, imagery, ritual, and memory. Past invasions are repeated in stories. Enemies are described as eternal. Values are framed as under constant attack. The population lives in a state of readiness, always one step away from crisis. In such conditions, people accept restrictions they would normally reject. Surveillance feels protective. Control feels caring. Obedience feels rational. Fear also simplifies the world. It divides reality into us and them, safe and dangerous, loyal and suspicious. This reduction is comforting. Complexity requires thought. Fear demands action. Empires rely on this simplification because it turns large, diverse populations into a unified mass with a shared emotional response. Once people fear together, they move together, they obey together, they justify together. This is why the first imperial reflex is always psychological before it is military. The battlefield is the mind. Once fear has defined the threat, power defines the solution. And the solution always involves concentration of authority, emergency measures, exceptional rules, temporary sacrifices that quietly become permanent. History shows this pattern repeatedly. Fear opens the door, authority enters, and once inside, it rearranges the house. Fear teaches people to trade freedom for protection, but protection rarely arrives without conditions. The empire does not say, obey forever. It says, obey for now until the danger passes. But the danger is never allowed to pass, because fear is the foundation on which control rests. When fear becomes normal, the extraordinary becomes acceptable. The empire no longer needs to convince. It only needs to remind people. Remember what they are afraid of. They remember why obedience once felt necessary, and memory keeps them compliant long after the original threat has disappeared. This is the first step in every imperial story. Not conquest, not ambition, but fear. And once fear defines reality, power shapes everything that follows. Once fear has prepared the ground, power seeks permanence, and permanence cannot be built on force alone. Force fades when generations change. What endures is meaning. This is where God's destiny and the sacred enter history, not as spiritual accidents, but as psychological architecture. Early empires understood something fundamental. Fear can mobilize people, but belief can stabilize them. A threat explains why obedience is necessary. A god explains why obedience is right. When power aligns itself with the sacred, it no longer appears human, it appears inevitable. Gods transform authority into order. Destiny transforms conquest into fate, and sacredness transforms violence into duty. This shift is subtle but decisive. When power claims divine backing, resistance stops being political and becomes moral. To oppose the empire is no longer to disagree. It is to offend the cosmic order. This is why empires consistently wrap themselves in sacred language. Kings become chosen, rulers become representatives, warriors become instruments of higher will. Even suffering is reframed as meaningful. Pain is no longer pointless, it is part of a larger plan. This idea is powerful because it answers the most dangerous question people ask during hardship: why is this happening to me? Destiny removes that question. It replaces uncertainty with acceptance. If something is destined, it must be endured. If something is sacred, it must not be questioned. This is not comfort, it is control disguised as meaning. The sacred creates distance between human decisions and human consequences. When atrocities are committed, responsibility dissolves because no one feels fully accountable. They were following destiny. They were serving the divine. They were protecting what is holy. This psychological separation allows empires to expand without collapsing under guilt. The sacred also freezes hierarchy. When power is sanctified, inequality becomes natural. Some are chosen, others are not. Some rule, others obey. This division no longer requires justification because it is framed as part of the universe itself. Challenging hierarchy then feels like challenging reality. Empires rely on this because it stabilizes roles across generations. A child born into obedience is told, "This is how the world works." And because the world itself is sacred, the structure feels permanent. Gods and destiny also solve another imperial problem. Time empires need continuity beyond individual rulers. Sacred narratives provide that they outlive kings, dynasties, and even borders. As long as the belief survives, the structure can be rebuilt. This is why empires fall, yet their psychological framework reappears under new names, new gods, new ideals, new sacred values. The language evolves, but the function remains. The sacred defines limits. It marks certain ideas as untouchable, certain questions as dangerous, certain truths as forbidden. And once limits are internalized, enforcement becomes unnecessary. People protect the sacred themselves. They silence doubt. They punish heresy. They defend the system even when it harms them, because harm feels acceptable if it serves something higher. This is the genius of sanctified power. It does not demand obedience, it inspires it. People do not submit because they are forced. They submit because they believe submission is meaningful. Empires that master the sacred do not rule bodies alone. They rule interpretation. They decide what events mean, what suffering signifies, what obedience represents. And once meaning is controlled, behavior follows naturally. This is why God's destiny and sacredness appear in every imperial story, not because humans are spiritual by nature, but because power understands that belief lasts longer than fear. And when belief replaces force, the empire no longer needs to fight its people. They fight for it, willingly convinced that they are participating in something eternal, rather than serving something human. Once fear has been established and meaning has been sanctified, the next step is subtle but decisive. The creation of the obedient human empires do not survive by controlling behavior alone. They survive by shaping the kind of person who no longer needs to be controlled. Obedience must stop feeling imposed and begin to feel natural. This is not achieved through punishment alone, but through formation. The obedient human is not born. They are produced slowly across childhood, ritual, education, and repetition. From an early age, individuals are taught not only what to do, but who they are. Loyalty becomes a virtue. Patience becomes maturity. Acceptance becomes wisdom. Questioning becomes immaturity or danger. The obedient human learns to associate safety with compliance and belonging with silence. Over time, obedience detaches from fear and attaches to identity. A person does not obey because they are threatened. They obey because obedience feels like who they are. This transformation is crucial because a human who obeys out of fear will resist when fear weakens. But a human who obeys out of identity will defend obedience even when it causes harm. Empires understand this instinctively. They invest in symbols, ceremonies, uniforms, language, and roles. These are not decoration, they are psychological tools. They teach the individual how to see themselves. A soldier is not merely someone who fights. A citizen is not merely someone who lives within borders. These identities carry emotional weight: pride, shame, honor, duty. Once these emotions are attached to roles, the individual becomes self-regulating. They monitor their thoughts before anyone else does. They feel guilt without being accused. They feel anxiety without being threatened. This is the most efficient form of control because the empire no longer needs to watch closely. The individual does the watching for it. The obedient human also learns to mistake morality for conformity. Doing what is expected feels good. Disrupting order feels wrong, even when order is unjust. This is how obedience becomes ethical rather than political. The question is no longer, is this right? The question becomes, is this appropriate? This shift removes resistance. Because moral people rarely see themselves as instruments of harm, they believe they are protecting stability, decency, or tradition. Empires rely on this belief. The obedient human is also trained to fear isolation more than injustice. To stand apart is framed as selfish, dangerous, or unstable. Belonging becomes conditional on alignment, and alignment becomes survival. The individual learns quickly. They soften their edges, they silence their doubts, they adapt their language, and they call this maturity. What is lost in this process is not intelligence, but independence. The obedient human can think brilliantly within permitted boundaries, but struggles to imagine outside them. This is why obedience does not look like ignorance. It looks like competence, functioning, responsibility. Empires do not need unthinking subjects. They need reliable ones, people who question privately but comply publicly, people who feel uneasy but remain loyal, people who sense contradiction but prioritize order. This is the finished product of imperial psychology, a population that maintains itself. The invention is complete when obedience no longer feels like submission, but like common sense. At that point, power becomes invisible. And invisible power is the hardest to dismantle, because it no longer appears as power. It appears as normal life. And when obedience becomes normal, the empire does not need to rule aggressively. It simply continues while people live inside. It convinced that nothing else was ever possible. Every empire eventually needs an enemy, not always because an enemy truly exists, but because identity requires contrast. Once obedience has been normalized and roles have been internalized, the next psychological step is division. The world is split into us and them. Belonging is defined not only by who you are, but by who you are not. This distinction simplifies reality, and simplification is essential for control. Complex worlds produce questions. Divided worlds produce certainty. When people know clearly where they stand, they stop asking where the system stands. The category of us becomes associated with safety, morality, and legitimacy, while them becomes associated with danger, chaos, and threat. This association does not require constant evidence. It only requires repetition over time. Fear attaches itself to faces, accents, beliefs, and behaviors rather than actions. This is powerful because it transforms abstract control into emotional reaction. People no longer respond to policies, they respond to identity. The enemy does not need to act to remain dangerous. Their existence alone is enough. This allows the empire to maintain unity internally, because internal conflict is redirected outward. Frustration that might turn inward toward authority is instead aimed at the other. The psychology is elegant. Fear binds the group. Loyalty deepens. Suspicion becomes virtue. Questioning empathy becomes weakness. Once this division is established, moral rules shift. Actions that would be unacceptable within the group become justified against outsiders. Violence becomes protection. Exclusion becomes defense. Cruelty becomes necessity. The individual does not experience this as wrongdoing. They experience it as responsibility. To protect us is to act against them. Even silence becomes participation, because refusing to join the narrative risks being reassigned from us to them. This is how the boundary polices itself. The fear of crossing it keeps people aligned. Empires rely on this because it stabilizes identity. When the world is divided, belonging feels fragile and must be constantly proven. People demonstrate loyalty through language, through silence, through shared outrage. Even neutrality becomes suspicious. There is no safe middle ground because the system requires clarity. The US and them psychology also prevents solidarity across boundaries. People who share suffering cannot unite if they are trained to see each other as fundamentally different. This fragmentation protects the center of power while those at the edges blame one another. History shows this pattern repeating endlessly. Different empires, different enemies, same division. The labels change. Barbarian, infidel, heretic, foreigner, traitor, extremist. But the function remains identical. They mark who can be harmed without consequence. And once a group is placed outside, moral concern control becomes easier within. The final effect of this psychology is internalization. People begin to divide themselves. They police their own thoughts, wondering which side they belong to. Doubt becomes dangerous. Curiosity becomes risky. The individual learns to align instinctively because alignment feels like safety. The greatest strength of the US and them structure is that it does not need constant enforcement. People defend it passionately because it gives them identity, clarity, and belonging. And as long as people know who they are against, they rarely ask who benefits from the division. This is why empires invest so heavily in difference, because unity among the ruled is the only thing power truly fears, and division ensures that fear never becomes collective. Understanding this is unsettling because it reveals that hatred is often taught and loyalty is often engineered, and that the line between us and them is not discovered in reality. It is drawn deliberately where it is most useful for control. Silence is not emptiness, it is participation. When an empire reaches maturity, it no longer relies primarily on fear, belief, or division. It relies on something quieter, normalization. What was once shocking becomes familiar. What was once questioned becomes routine. What was once resisted becomes expected. This transition does not happen suddenly. It happens through silence. Small acts of compliance repeated daily. Words left unspoken, reactions withheld. Questions postponed. Normalization is not imposed, it is learned. People adapt not because they agree, but because adaptation feels easier than resistance. Silence becomes the language of survival. At first, it is cautious. A person stays quiet to avoid trouble. Then it becomes practical. A person stays quiet to avoid inconvenience. Eventually, it becomes moral. A person stays quiet because speaking feels disruptive, immature, or unnecessary. At this stage, silence is no longer experienced as fear. It is experienced as common sense. This is how systems stabilize themselves, without needing constant enforcement, without visible repression. When everyone behaves as if something is normal, it becomes normal even if it is harmful, even if it contradicts lived reality. Normalization works by narrowing attention. People stop noticing what has always been there. Violence, injustice, inequality do not disappear. They fade into the background. Like noise in a city, they are no longer heard. Silence allows this fading because attention is a form of resistance, and when attention is withdrawn, power moves freely. In normalized systems, people do not ask, "Is this right?" They ask, "Is this how things are done?" The difference is subtle but decisive. Once behavior is framed as routine, moral evaluation shuts down. Individuals feel less responsible because they are doing nothing extraordinary. They are simply following the flow. Silence also spreads socially. People take cues from one another when no one speaks. Each person assumes others accept the situation. Doubt remains private, compliance becomes public. This creates the illusion of consensus, even when discomfort is widespread. History shows that many systems persisted, not because everyone believed in them, but because everyone believed everyone else did. Silence reinforces itself. It tells each individual that resistance is isolated and therefore futile. Normalization also reshapes memory. People forget that things were ever different. They grow up inside structures and assume they are natural, eternal, even necessary. The past becomes unimaginable, and without comparison, the present feels inevitable. This is one of the most effective forms of control, because it does not feel like control, it feels like reality. Silence protects this illusion. Speaking threatens it, because speech reintroduces contrast. It reminds people that what feels normal is constructed, and once something is seen as constructed, it can be questioned. This is why silence is rewarded, not always explicitly but socially. Those who remain quiet are considered reasonable, balanced, mature. Those who speak are seen as disruptive, excessive, or naive. The system does not need to punish dissent harshly. It only needs to frame it as unnecessary. Over time, people internalize this judgment. They silence themselves before others need to. Silence becomes self-maintenance, and normalization completes its work. When a system reaches this stage, it does not require loyalty. It requires inertia. People move with it because stopping would require effort, awareness, and risk. The greatest strength of normalization is that it removes urgency. Nothing feels wrong enough. Nothing feels immediate enough. Nothing feels personal enough. Silence keeps life functioning while injustice persists. And this is the final refinement of power. Not the ability to force obedience, but the ability to make obedience invisible. To make silence feel neutral, and to make questioning feel out of place. When silence and normalization merge, the system no longer needs to assert itself. It simply continues, and people live inside it, calling it normal life, unaware that what they have adapted to is exactly what once required explanation. One of the most enduring myths in history is the idea that empires are sustained only by cruel people. This belief is comforting because it allows distance. It tells us that harm is caused by monsters, by villains, by those who are visibly immoral. But history shows something far more unsettling. Empires survive because of good people. Ordinary people, decent people, people who care about their families, their communities, their sense of right and wrong. The problem is not the absence of morality inside empires. It is the way morality is redirected. The good person inside an empire rarely wakes up intending to cause harm. They do not see themselves as participants in oppression. They see themselves as responsible workers, loyal citizens, disciplined professionals. They follow rules because rules feel stabilizing. They fulfill roles because roles provide identity. They tell themselves they are simply doing their job. And this phrase carries enormous psychological weight because it separates intention from consequence. Once a person believes they are only responsible for their task, they feel released from responsibility for the outcome. Harm becomes indirect. It becomes procedural. It becomes someone else's decision higher up, further away, abstracted by hierarchy. This is how good intentions coexist with destructive systems. The good person inside the empire often believes that personal morality is enough. As long as they are kind in private fare, in small interactions, respectful in tone, they assume they are on the right side of history. But systems do not operate at the level of individual kindness. They operate at the level of structure. A system can function smoothly even when its participants are personally ethical. This is why empires do not require widespread cruelty. They require widespread compliance. The good person is especially valuable to the system because they give it legitimacy. When decent people participate, the system appears humane. When moral people comply, injustice looks reasonable. The presence of good people reassures everyone else that nothing is fundamentally wrong. Because if someone ethical can accept it, it must be acceptable. This is the quiet danger of goodness, detached from awareness. The good person inside the empire also avoids confrontation, not out of fear, but out of virtue. They do not want to create conflict. They do not want to destabilize order. They do not want to appear extreme. They value harmony, politeness, civility. And these values are admirable in human relationships. But in unjust systems, they become tools of preservation. Silence is framed as maturity, patience as wisdom, restraint as responsibility. The good person learns to tolerate what they would otherwise oppose, because opposition feels disruptive and disruption feels wrong. This is how morality becomes inverted. The most unsettling truth is that the good person often suffers the most. From the system they sustain, they experience guilt, confusion, quiet unease. But they suppress it because acknowledging it would demand action, and action would threaten the stability they have built their life around: family security, social standing, professional identity. The cost feels too high, so they compartmentalize. They say the system is flawed but necessary. They say change must be gradual. They say someone else will fix it. This is not hypocrisy. It is psychological survival. The empire depends on this internal compromise. The good person inside the empire is not evil. They are adapted. They have learned how to live with contradiction without collapsing under it. And that adaptation is precisely what allows systems to persist across generations. History does not move forward when good people feel bad. It moves forward when good people recognize that personal virtue is not enough, when they understand that morality without awareness can become compliance, when they realize that refusing to cause harm is not the same as refusing to participate in harm. This is why the problem of the good person is so central to imperial psychology. Empires do not fall because villains are exposed. Villains are expected. Empires weaken when good people stop using their goodness as a shield against responsibility and begin asking the most uncomfortable question of all. What am I allowing to continue by simply being decent within a system that is not? Empires do not lack intelligence. They lack the ability to doubt themselves. Self-criticism is not a weakness of understanding. It is a threat to survival. An empire cannot truly criticize itself because its existence depends on the belief that it is necessary, justified, and stable to question itself. Honestly would mean questioning the very foundation on which authority rests, and authority cannot survive uncertainty. Once a system is built, every part of it is invested in maintaining coherence. Admitting error is not a simple correction. It creates a crack. And cracks spread. Empires understand this instinctively, so they redefine criticism. They do not eliminate it entirely. They control its form. Criticism is allowed as long as it does not challenge structure. It can address efficiency, corruption at the margins, behavior of individuals, but it must never question legitimacy, purpose, or direction. When criticism approaches these areas, it is reframed as disloyalty, extremism, or danger. This is how self-preservation disguises itself as stability. Empires also struggle with self-criticism because power is cumulative. Every decision rests on previous decisions. To admit that one layer is wrong would call into question all that followed. This creates a psychological trap. The longer an empire exists, the harder it becomes to acknowledge foundational error, because the cost of admitting it grows with time. Lives, institutions, identities, and histories are built on the assumption that the system is right. Admitting fault would mean admitting that suffering was unnecessary, that sacrifices were demanded under false pretenses, that obedience was misdirected. Few systems are willing to face that weight. Instead, they rewrite memory. They reinterpret mistakes as necessities, failures as miscalculations, violence as unfortunate but required. This narrative adjustment allows the system to move forward without pausing to reflect. The empire does not say we were wrong. It says circumstances were difficult. History is complex. There was no alternative. Self-criticism also threatens internal unity. Empires rely on shared belief to maintain cohesion. If doubt spreads from the center, it destabilizes the whole. The population may tolerate corruption. They may tolerate inequality. They may even tolerate cruelty, but they rarely tolerate uncertainty at the top. Authority must appear confident even when it is failing. This is why leaders often double down in moments of crisis. Retreat looks like weakness. Compromise looks like surrender. Apology looks like collapse. In such environments, honest reflection is interpreted as decay. Empires also train individuals within them to avoid self-criticism. People internalize the system's defensiveness. They feel personally attacked when the empire is questioned, because identity has been fused with structure. To criticize the system feels like criticizing the self. This emotional fusion ensures that even when evidence accumulates, people resist acknowledging it. They defend not because they are convinced, but because letting go would fracture their sense of meaning. The empire thus becomes incapable of hearing truths about itself, because truth threatens continuity, and continuity is valued above accuracy. This is why empires rarely correct course early. They wait until correction is no longer possible. By the time self-criticism becomes unavoidable, the structure is already hollow. Self-reflection arrives too late, after collapse has already begun. History records this as sudden downfall, but the inability to criticize oneself was present from the beginning. Empires do not fall because they ignore criticism. They fall because they were designed to do so. Self-criticism requires humility, and humility requires accepting that authority is temporary. Empires cannot accept this, because accepting impermanence would mean surrendering the illusion that they were ever meant to last. And so they continue forward confident, inflexible, and increasingly disconnected from reality until reality no longer accommodates them, and the silence they maintained around their own flaws becomes the force that finally breaks them. When a system collapses, people expect freedom to arrive immediately. But history shows something far more disturbing. Systems can fall while the psychology that sustained them remains intact. Buildings change, flags change, laws change, leaders disappear. Yet behavior often stays the same because systems do not live only in institutions. They live inside habits, reflexes, fears, and expectations. Long after external control is removed, people continue to act as if it still exists. They censor themselves. They wait for permission. They search for authority even when none is present. This is because obedience is not erased by collapse. It has been rehearsed for generations. A person raised inside a system does not suddenly become free when the system disappears. They become uncertain. Freedom requires skills that obedience never taught. How to decide without instruction, how to disagree without enemies, how to stand without validation. This is why the end of a system often creates anxiety rather than relief. People feel exposed, disoriented, ungrounded. The structure that once told them who they were is gone, and without it, identity feels fragile. Many begin to miss what oppressed them, not because it was good, but because it was familiar. This nostalgia is not love for the system. It is fear of undefined space. History shows that after empires fall, new systems often rise quickly using the same psychological patterns. Different names, same obedience, different symbols, same fear. People recreate hierarchy because hierarchy feels stabilizing. They recreate authority because authority feels reassuring. They recreate division because clarity feels safer than complexity. The mind seeks replacement structures the way the body seeks shelter. This is why revolutions often reproduce what they destroy. The system falls, but the psychology rebuilds it. The most difficult transformation is not political, it is internal. It requires unlearning reflexes that once ensured survival. Silence learned under punishment does not vanish when punishment ends. Compliance learned through reward does not disappear when rewards change. Even resistance can become habitual, reactive rather than conscious. True freedom demands awareness of these inherited patterns. It demands noticing when fear guides behavior, even in the absence of threat, when obedience feels moral even without authority, when conformity feels natural even without enforcement. This awareness is rare because it offers no immediate comfort. It removes excuses, it reveals responsibility. A person who sees the pattern can no longer blame the system entirely, nor can they rely on it to define them. They must choose how to live without the guarantee of structure. This is why psychological liberation always lags behind political change, and why many societies replace one system with another, rather than learning to exist without one. Systems fall easily compared to the habits they leave behind. The ruins are visible. The conditioning is not. This is the quiet truth. History teaches again and again. The hardest empire to dismantle is not the one outside. It is the one that continues operating internally, shaping behavior long after the throne is empty. And until that internal empire is recognized, questioned, and slowly undone, the cycle continues. New systems, new names, same psychology, and the past repeats not because history is cruel, but because awareness is rare. When empires fall, people expect celebration, relief, freedom, closure. But what history shows again and again is something far more complex. The fall of an empire rarely feels like victory to those living inside it. It feels like disorientation. The structure that once explained the world disappears suddenly or slowly, and in its absence, people do not immediately feel free. They feel unanchored. For generations, the empire told them who they were, where they belonged, what was normal, what was dangerous, what was allowed, and what was forbidden. Even when that structure was oppressive, it provided orientation. And when orientation collapses, the first emotion is not joy, it is confusion. Many feel anxiety because the rules that once governed life no longer apply. Certainty vanishes, expectations dissolve. People are forced to decide without guidance, and decision without training feels terrifying. This is why freedom after collapse often feels heavier than oppression before it. The empire carried responsibility. Once it falls, responsibility returns to the individual and the community, and many are not prepared to carry it. People also feel loss, not only loss of power or status, but loss of meaning. Empires give narratives. They tell people that their suffering served a purpose, that their sacrifices mattered, that history was moving in a clear direction. When the empire falls, that narrative collapses, and with it the justification for years of endurance. People look back and ask, was it all for nothing? This question is painful because it threatens identity. If the system was wrong, then what does that say about the life lived inside it? This is why nostalgia often appears after collapse. People begin to romanticize the past, not because it was better, but because it was understandable. Memory becomes selective. Hardship is softened, certainty is exaggerated. The empire is remembered not as it was, but as it felt stable. This nostalgia is not political, it is psychological. It is the mind seeking refuge from uncertainty. Another common emotion is emptiness. After years of reacting, obeying, adapting, resisting, surviving, there is suddenly nothing to push against. The external pressure that structured daily life is gone. And without pressure, many people feel hollow. They do not know what to want. Desire was shaped by opposition. Goals were defined by limits. Once those limits disappear, purpose becomes unclear. This emptiness can lead to apathy or to the search for a new authority, something to replace what was lost. History shows that many people trade one system for another quickly, not because they want domination, but because they want structure. Collapse also brings fear. Fear of chaos, fear of fragmentation, fear of violence. People worry that without the old order, nothing will hold society together. Even a broken system feels safer than an unknown future. This fear often delays real change. It pushes people to accept new versions of the same hierarchy under different names. Stability is chosen over transformation because transformation requires patience, courage, and trust. And trust is fragile after long control. There is also grief. Grief for time lost for opportunities, denied for questions, never asked for selves, never lived. This grief is often silent because it has no clear object. It is not mourning a person but a possibility. And mourning possibility is one of the hardest forms of grief because it cannot be repaired, only acknowledged. Finally, there is a quiet relief that arrives slowly after the noise fades. Not the relief of victory, but the relief of honesty. The relief of no longer pretending that the system worked. The relief of naming what was endured. This relief does not shout. It settles, it allows reflection. It allows memory to reorganize. It allows people to see themselves not as failures, but as survivors. And in that space, something new becomes possible. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. The fall of an empire does not resolve history. It exposes it. It leaves people face to face with themselves, without excuses, without scripts, without guarantees. What they feel in that moment determines what comes next. Whether they rebuild the same psychology or begin the slow, difficult work of living without it, empires fall on paper in monuments and dates, but they fall inside people much more slowly. And that internal fall is the one that truly shapes the future. Human psychology changes slowly, not because people resist progress, but because the mind is built for survival and truth. Long before societies existed, the human brain evolved to detect threat, seek belonging and avoid isolation. These instincts kept early humans alive, and instincts that protect life are rarely abandoned easily. Even when the environment changes, the nervous system remains cautious. It treats uncertainty as danger and familiarity as safety. This biological foundation shapes everything that follows. Culture, technology, and ideology may shift rapidly, but the emotional core of the human mind lags behind. The brain does not update at the speed of invention. It updates at the speed of experience, passed down through behavior, tone, and silence across generations. This is why modern humans can live inside ancient psychological patterns while using advanced tools. Fear of exclusion, desire for approval, need for authority. These are not taught explicitly. They are absorbed early and reinforced constantly. Human psychology also changes slowly because repetition creates normality. The mind adapts to conditions by making them feel ordinary. What is repeated becomes expected. What is expected becomes accepted. This adaptation is efficient for survival but costly for freedom. People stop reacting not because conditions improve, but because resistance becomes exhausting. Over time, the mind conserves energy by adjusting expectations instead of demanding change. This quiet adjustment happens beneath awareness, which makes it difficult to reverse. Another reason psychology resists rapid change is because identity is formed around existing patterns. Beliefs, habits, and roles become intertwined with the sense of self. Changing them feels like losing oneself. People experience this as danger even when change is beneficial. The mind asks, "Who am I without this structure?" And when that question has no immediate answer, the safest response is to remain as you are. This is why people often defend outdated systems. They are not protecting ideas. They are protecting identity. Psychology also moves slowly because it is social. Humans calibrate themselves to others. Behavior, emotion, and belief are mirrored within groups. A person may privately doubt something but publicly conform because isolation feels worse than contradiction. This social feedback loop reinforces existing patterns. Even when individuals change, the group often pulls them back. This creates inertia. Collective psychology moves at the pace of trust, and trust takes time to rebuild. Once broken, trauma further slows change. Traumatic experiences teach the mind to prioritize safety above all else. Even long after the threat has passed, the body remains vigilant. This hypervigilance narrows perception and reduces openness. People become less willing to explore uncertainty, more willing to cling to what is known. Healing trauma is not a matter of insight, it is a matter of time, consistency, and safety. And until safety is felt, change remains threatening. Finally, human psychology changes slowly because awareness itself is demanding. It requires attention, honesty, and discomfort. It asks people to sit with contradiction without resolving it immediately. Many prefer clarity, even false clarity, over prolonged uncertainty. Systems exploit this preference, offering simple explanations and stable roles. The mind accepts them gratefully because complexity is tiring. This does not mean humans are incapable of change. It means change arrives through accumulation, not revolution, through repeated experiences that slowly reshape perception, through moments of doubt that return again and again, until the old framework can no longer hold. Understanding this is crucial because it explains why empires outlive belief, why systems persist beyond legitimacy, and why history appears to repeat. Human psychology is not stubborn, it is cautious, it carries memory. It values survival over transformation, and until environments are created where curiosity feels as safe as conformity, psychology will continue to change slowly, even as the world around it accelerates. History is not only what happened, it is what was selected, what was framed, what was repeated, and what was quietly allowed to disappear. Memory is not neutral, it is curated long before events become history. They pass through power, through institutions, through narratives that decide what is worth remembering and what must be forgotten. This process does not always feel like censorship. Often it feels like storytelling. Victories are highlighted, losses are softened, crimes are renamed, sacrifice is glorified, and complexity is reduced, so the past can feel coherent. History remembers what supports continuity. Empires understand this deeply. They do not only rule territory, they rule memory, because controlling the past stabilizes the present. When people remember their history as heroic, inevitable, or righteous, they are more willing to accept the structures inherited from it. This is why imperial histories are filled with founding myths, golden ages, civilizing missions, great leaders. They offer pride and identity, but beneath these stories lie silenced experiences, voices that were inconvenient, suffering that did not fit the narrative. Memory management does not require erasing everything. It only requires emphasis. By repeating certain stories often enough, others fade naturally. People forget not because they are forbidden to remember, but because they are never reminded. This selective remembering shapes moral perception. When past violence is framed as necessity, present violence feels justifiable. When oppression is remembered as order, modern control feels reasonable. History becomes a moral shield. The phrase, "this is how it has always been done," carries enormous power because it implies inevitability. Memory also shapes who is seen as legitimate. Heroes are elevated, rebels are reduced to footnotes or villains. Complex figures are simplified into symbols that serve present needs. Those who challenge systems too early are often remembered only after the system has changed, and even then they are sanitized, their danger removed, their questions softened, their radicalism transformed into inspiration without threat. Memory thus neutralizes dissent retroactively. It honors voices only when they can no longer disrupt. This creates a distorted relationship with the past. People admire courage without practicing it. They celebrate truth-tellers long after truth-telling is safe. History becomes comfortable because discomfort has been edited out. Another layer of memory management is omission. Entire groups disappear from official narratives. Workers, colonized peoples, women, minorities, the poor. Their experiences are often treated as background rather than central forces. This absence creates the illusion that history was shaped only by leaders' decisions and battles, rather than by collective endurance and suffering. When these lives are not remembered, their struggles are repeated. Memory loss becomes repetition. History also feels clearer than the present, because uncertainty has been removed. Outcomes are known, mistakes appear obvious. Choices seem simple, but this clarity is artificial. It is produced by hindsight and narrative framing. While living inside events, people rarely experience clarity. They experience confusion, fear, contradiction. But memory cleans this away. It presents the past as more decisive than it was. This makes people underestimate how difficult it is to act differently in the present. They ask, why didn't they resist, without recognizing how normalized injustice had become. Memory thus judges the past harshly while excusing the present. The management of memory ensures that lessons are abstract rather than actionable. We say never again while repeating the same structures under new language. We condemn yesterday's empires while participating in today's systems, because memory has separated condemnation from recognition. To truly remember history is not to recite dates or celebrate victories. It is to feel the uncertainty, the pressure, the fear that shaped choices. It is to recognize how normal injustice felt while it was happening. Memory that does not recreate that psychological environment is incomplete. It reassures rather than warns. The most dangerous form of forgetting is not ignorance, it is comfort. When history is remembered in a way that flatters identity and avoids responsibility, it becomes a tool of control rather than understanding. This is why the question is not only what happened, but who decides what is remembered and whose silence made that decision possible. Until memory includes what was excluded, until history remembers discomfort as vividly as triumph, the past will continue to repeat itself. Not because humans fail to learn, but because they learn a version of history designed to feel safe rather than true. Is your inner voice truly yours, or does it only feel personal because it speaks from inside your head? Most people trust their inner voice more than any external authority. They call it conscience, intuition, common sense. But few stop to ask where that voice learned to speak. The inner voice does not emerge in isolation. It is shaped long before you can question it, by tone, by reaction, by approval and disappointment, by reward and withdrawal. From childhood, you are not only taught what is right and wrong, you are taught how wrong should feel. Guilt becomes a sensation, fear becomes a warning, obedience becomes relief. Over time, these emotional responses turn into a voice that feels internal, automatic, unquestionable. This is how control moves inward. A system does not need to watch you if you are already watching yourself. Many people call this voice conscience, but conscience is not a pure signal, it is a mixture, a blend of care and fear, of empathy and conditioning. It tells you when you have hurt someone, but it also tells you when you have crossed an invisible line drawn by family culture or authority. The voice does not always ask, "Is this right?" It often asks, "Will this cost me belonging, approval, safety?" This is where fear disguises itself as morality. The body reacts before the mind can explain. You feel discomfort, anxiety, shame, and you obey, without knowing exactly why. Learned guilt is one of the most powerful tools of internal control. Unlike punishment, it leaves no visible scar. Unlike rules, it leaves no written trace. It lives in sensation, a tight chest, a sinking feeling, a sense of having done something wrong even when no harm was caused. This guilt is often inherited, not chosen. It reflects the anxieties of previous generations passed down as caution. Silence was safer. Obedience was rewarded. Questioning was dangerous. The inner voice carries these lessons forward long after the original threats are gone. Parental voices also live inside the inner voice, not as exact words, but as patterns. Approval sounds like warmth. Disapproval sounds like tension. Even as adults, people seek the same emotional signals. They avoid choices that trigger the old discomfort. They pursue paths that recreate familiar validation. This is not weakness, it is training. Society reinforces this internal structure. Norms are repeated so often that they feel natural. Expectations are framed as responsibility. Deviations are framed as immaturity or risk. The inner voice learns to correct behavior before society has to. It whispers, "Do not say that. Do not think that. Stay in line. Be reasonable." This is how external authority becomes internal governance. The most unsettling truth is that this voice feels like you. It uses your language, your memories, your emotions. And because of that, you rarely challenge it. You assume it is wisdom, but not every inner warning is insight. And not every sense of wrong is moral clarity. Some are echoes of past control, preserved for stability. The moment you pause and observe the inner voice, instead of obeying it, something shifts. You begin to notice its tone. Is it calm or anxious? Curious or defensive? Does it invite understanding or enforce restraint? Does it open space or close it? This observation creates distance, and distance creates freedom. Not the freedom to ignore conscience, but the freedom to refine it, to separate empathy from fear, responsibility from conditioning, care from compliance. The inner voice does not disappear when examined. It becomes quieter, clearer, more intentional. It stops reacting and begins responding. This is where internal control weakens, because a person who can distinguish between awareness and conditioning is no longer fully governed from within. Systems depend on unquestioned inner voices more than external enforcement. When people police themselves, power becomes efficient, invisible, and stable. This is why examining your inner voice is one of the most disruptive acts possible. Not because it makes you rebellious, but because it makes you conscious, and consciousness interrupts automatic obedience. The question is not whether your inner voice exists. It does. The question is whose survival it was trained to protect, and whether you are willing to listen closely enough to decide which parts of it still deserve your loyalty. Why do people fail to act on what they already know is right? This question sits at the center of human contradiction. Knowledge alone does not move behavior. Fear, comfort, habit, and the need for belonging often override truth. People do not avoid action because they are ignorant. They avoid it because action carries consequences, and consequences threaten stability. Even when the mind understands the cost of inaction, the body chooses familiarity over integrity. This is why awareness does not automatically lead to change. And this is where the second question emerges. Why does freedom feel frightening? Freedom removes excuses. It removes authority to blame. It places responsibility directly on the individual. Freedom is not the absence of limits. It is the presence of choice, and choice exposes risk, error, and isolation. Many people prefer constraint because it offers direction and relief. From this fear of freedom grows the need to be normal, which leads to the final question: who needs the idea of the normal person? Normality is not a natural state. It is a social tool. It defines acceptable behavior limits, imagination, and rewards conformity. By labeling deviation as abnormal systems, maintain order without force. People adjust themselves to fit the definition because acceptance feels safer than authenticity. Together, these questions reveal a single pattern. Humans are not controlled only by power. They are controlled by fear of responsibility, fear of isolation, and fear of standing without permission. Until these fears are examined, knowledge remains passive. Freedom feels dangerous, and normality continues to shape lives quietly from the inside. Freedom is frightening because it removes the protections people quietly rely on. Even when those protections feel restrictive, they provide structure, direction, and excuse. Freedom offers none of that. When you are free, there is no one left to blame, no system to hide behind, no authority to point to when things go wrong. Every choice becomes personal, and every outcome feels earned or owned. This level of responsibility is heavy. Most people are not afraid of freedom itself. They are afraid of what freedom reveals about them. Freedom exposes uncertainty. It forces you to decide without guarantees, and the human mind craves certainty more than possibility. Even painful certainty feels safer than open space. Because it is familiar, freedom also threatens belonging. When you choose freely, you risk choosing differently, and choosing differently risks isolation. Groups survive through similarity, shared rules, shared rhythms, shared beliefs. Freedom disrupts that harmony. A free individual does not move automatically with the group. They pause, they question, they diverge. And divergence has always carried a social cost. Throughout history, exclusion meant danger. Even today, it triggers deep psychological alarm. This is why freedom feels lonely before it ever feels empowering. Another reason freedom is frightening is that it removes moral cover. Inside systems, morality is outsourced. You follow rules and feel righteous. You obey and feel innocent. Freedom takes that cover away. It asks not what is allowed, but what is right. and right is rarely clear. Freedom demands judgment without instruction. It requires living with doubt without immediate resolution. Many people mistake obedience for morality because obedience feels clean. It simplifies life. Freedom is messy. It involves contradiction, regret, and uncertainty. Freedom also collapses identity. Roles give people definition: worker, citizen, believer, normal person. These identities tell you who you are and how to act. Freedom dissolves them. It asks, "Who are you?" without the role. And for many, that question produces anxiety, not clarity. Because identity built over years cannot be replaced instantly. Without roles, people feel empty, exposed, undefined. This emptiness is often mistaken for failure when it is actually transition. But transition is uncomfortable, and humans are trained to avoid discomfort. Finally, freedom is frightening because it cannot be undone easily. Once you see that you are choosing, you cannot pretend you are not. Once you realize you could act differently, inaction becomes a decision, silence becomes participation, comfort becomes complicity. Freedom takes away the innocence of unawareness, and innocence is something people hold on to tightly. So many reject freedom not consciously but emotionally. They choose structure, they choose normality, they choose rules not because they are forced, but because they feel relieved to have them. Freedom is not rejected because it is bad. It is rejected because it is demanding. It does not promise safety, belonging, or meaning. It demands that you create them yourself. And that demand is heavier than any chain. This is why freedom has always been rare. Not because it was unavailable, but because few were willing to carry what comes with it. Freedom was never meant to feel comfortable. It was never designed to reassure or protect. It does not wrap itself in certainty or promise safety. What it offers instead is honesty, and honesty is heavy. To be free is not to escape responsibility, but to accept it fully, without excuses, without permission, without guarantees. Freedom does not arrive as a reward. It arrives as a question that stays with you long after the noise fades. Will you continue living inside what is familiar, or will you accept the risk of choosing consciously? This choice does not announce itself with drama. It appears quietly in everyday moments. In what you say and do not say, in what you tolerate and what you challenge, in what you justify and what you refuse. Freedom does not demand rebellion. It demands awareness, and awareness changes the meaning of every action. Once you see the structure you are inside, you are no longer innocent, but you are also no longer blind. You may still compromise, you may still adapt, you may still choose safety at times, but you will know what you are doing. And that knowledge reshapes everything. Freedom is not about being fearless. It is about acting without hiding from fear. It is not about being certain. It is about choosing despite uncertainty. And it is not about standing alone forever, but about being willing to stand alone when necessary. In the end, freedom is not something the world gives or takes. It is something you practice quietly every day, in how honestly you face yourself. And perhaps that is why freedom feels frightening, because it cannot be performed, it cannot be borrowed, it cannot be delegated, it can only be lived. And living it means stepping into the open without knowing who will stand with you or what will come next. The psychological mechanism of power does not begin with cruelty. It begins with perception. When an individual or institution accumulates authority, something subtle but profound starts to shift inside the human mind. Power does not simply expand what a person can do. It quietly reshapes how reality itself is interpreted. This transformation is rarely sudden. It unfolds gradually, often invisibly, and frequently without conscious awareness. The person in power usually does not feel morally corrupted. In fact, the opposite often occurs. They begin to feel more responsible, more justified, and more certain that their decisions are necessary. One of the core drivers of this shift is cognitive dissonance reduction. Humans have a deep psychological need to see themselves as rational and morally consistent. When someone with power makes a harsh or controversial decision, the mind experiences tension between the action taken and the self-image of being reasonable or just. To resolve this discomfort, the brain often adjusts the interpretation of the action rather than the self-image. The decision becomes reframed as necessary. The consequences become minimized. The opposition becomes easier to dismiss. Over time, this process builds a powerful internal narrative. If I chose it, there must have been a good reason. Closely connected to this is what psychologists sometimes call moral licensing. The more responsibility and status individuals believe they carry, the more likely they are to feel that difficult decisions fall uniquely within their legitimate authority. Power creates a psychological environment in which exceptional actions begin to feel proportionate to exceptional responsibility. What might once have felt extreme begins to feel situational. What once required hesitation begins to feel procedural. This is not always driven by malice. It often emerges from the human tendency to align behavior with perceived role expectations. Authority bias further amplifies the effect. Not only does power reshape the mind of the person who holds it, but it also alters how others respond to that person. When authority is recognized, surrounding individuals become more likely to defer, to agree, or to remain silent in the face of questionable decisions. This social reinforcement loop is critical because power rarely operates in isolation. It is stabilized by the reactions of those nearby. When dissent weakens and agreement becomes the dominant feedback signal, the internal confidence of the decision-maker strengthens even further. Over time, a feedback chamber can form. Successful decisions from the past create reputational momentum. Future doubts are filtered through prior victories. Institutional systems begin to protect established authority rather than continuously challenge it. What begins as functional leadership can gradually harden into something more rigid, a structure that becomes increasingly resistant to self-correction. The danger here is not immediate tyranny. The danger is progressive insulation. Historical patterns suggest that the most consequential errors often do not occur when leaders feel uncertain. They occur when leaders feel unusually certain, when the internal checks of doubt have been softened by repeated reinforcement, when the external checks of criticism have weakened due to hierarchy or fear, when both internal and external friction decline at the same time. The psychological environment becomes uniquely vulnerable to overreach. This is why the psychology of power is so persistent across different eras, cultures, and political systems. The surface language changes, the symbols of authority change, the institutions change, but the underlying cognitive pressures remain remarkably consistent. Power increases perceived responsibility. Responsibility encourages justification. Justification reduces doubt. Reduced doubt weakens self-correction. And in that narrowing space, some of history's most consequential misjudgments have quietly taken shape. Understanding this mechanism does not require assuming that every powerful figure intended harm. More often, the pattern emerges from ordinary human cognitive architecture, operating under extraordinary levels of influence. The mind adapts to authority, the environment reinforces confidence, and slowly, often imperceptibly, the distance between certainty and error begins to shrink. This is the quiet psychological gravity that has followed power throughout human history, not as an exception, but as a recurring structural tendency built into the way human cognition responds to control, responsibility, and reinforced belief. And so the pattern repeats, quietly, patiently, and often unnoticed until it is far too late. Power that believes it is right rarely feels dangerous from the inside. It feels responsible. It feels necessary. It feels justified. But history has shown, again and again, that the greatest risks often emerge not when power is uncertain, but when it becomes completely sure of itself. If this video made you pause, even for a moment, then you are already doing something many systems struggle to do. You are questioning the surface. You are looking beneath the certainty. And that is exactly what this channel is built for. If you want more deep historical and philosophical journeys into the hidden mechanisms that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to the Enigmatic Veil, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because here, we don't just revisit history, we examine the patterns behind it. And until the next veil is lifted, stay curious.